This is Pat Langley. I really can't do a great bio for her because I just met her for the first time today in person.
I'll do it.
But thank you very much for coming.
Okay. I'm Pat Langley. I've been in Springfield 34 years, 35. I can't count anymore. I came here in 1977, so how many ever that is. I came here to teach at Sangamon State University, and I'm a lawyer by training. And when I got out of law school, I worked for the Legal Services Corporation, which provided free legal services for poor people. I did this in Detroit, Michigan. Almost all my clients were black women. And their problems, legal was just like the tip of the iceberg of the problems. Most of the problems were really about poverty and what that means. And I did everything. I didn't do criminal law, but I did a lot of civil law. I did landlord-tenant, and I worked with methadone maintenance clients who would remember me one day and not the next. And I did all kinds of that stuff. Did child custody and divorce stuff, all that kind of stuff. I helped start an organization in Detroit called the Women's Justice Center in 1975, I guess. And it's still going, which is actually really cool. So creating an institution. But at that time, we were trying to deal with domestic violence. There was not a shelter in Detroit, metropolitan Detroit. There was no shelter in 1975. And, cops would come around and walk a guy around the block and say, "Don't hit her so hard." And that was the response to domestic violence. So we worked on those kinds of issues. I had always wanted to teach, and when I found Sangamon State, I was elated because a lot of the faculty were radical, political. I walked in and said, "Where's the union?" And got involved. So I started in legal studies there, which was an interdisciplinary program, and I got less and less enchanted with the legal studies students. They were sort of like law students, which was not a good group. I mean, I'm not actually very fond of lawyers, and most of them are assholes, and I didn't want to grow up and be one. So, and I also began to realize that practicing law was just, as Letty Bruce said, the only justice in the halls of justice is in the halls. And that was certainly my experience, and some really bad stuff happened, and I couldn't take it, and I could see it was wearing on me and sort of changing me, and I'm like, you know what, this is not what I want to do. So I came here in 1977, and I gradually shifted into women and gender studies, and taught the first course out at the university on what I call Gay 101. It was called Sexual Orientation and Public Policy, but we looked at all the legal issues and policy issues and sort of history and all that stuff. So I was really active in the faculty union until they busted it when we became the U of I. I was chief negotiator, grievance officer, bottle washer. I did all that stuff. We had it for 10 years, and it was really good. And then the U of I came along, and they just wrote it out of existence in legislation, and we appealed all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court and lost. And that was the end of the union. They're trying to reorganize there now, which is actually, I think, a really good thing, because there's a lot of bean counters and soulless people. Anyway, I've been active in politics. I'm a political junkie in lots of ways. I keep up. I do a lot of things that are meaningful to me. When I was in Detroit, I worked a lot on prison reform with the National Lawyers Guild, which was accused in the 50s of being a communist front, and it actually was. It wasn't a communist front, but it was definitely communist, and actually they were really doing good work. They were the only people doing prison work. And that was, nobody gives a shit about prisoners. So when you're doing work for prisoners, you're, doing that. I've been arrested a number of times, and I've engaged in a lot of different actions myself. I got involved in politics in my family with the war, the Vietnam War in the early 60s, and civil rights. And my family belonged to the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union. So I came from a family of sort of political activists, and that stuck. I also have a right-wing sister who voted for, George Wallace, George Bush II, it's like, and Rosh would vote for Rush Limbaugh if she could, but, so, my family's diverse too. I think we're adopted, but not really. Anyway, so tonight I'm going to talk about ACT UP, because ACT UP for me is, when Occupy Wall Street first sprung up, I was like, oh my God, it's ACT UP, sort of reborn, not reborn Christian, but reborn something, reborn pagan, reborn whatever. It is many similarities. So I want to tell you a little bit about ACT UP. I'm going to go through sort of its history, its founding, a little bit about its history, and I'm going to show you a lot of slides because the visual is so, when you see it, you will identify immediately with everything that's been going on with Occupy Wall Street all over the country. And you'll see they could be the same thing in some ways. This is Larry Kramer. He's in his 70s now. He's had AIDS for quite a while. Like most people now in the United States, most people now in the United States live 35 years past their diagnosis. That's not true in Africa. That's not true for poor people. If you can afford the drugs, you have a very good chance of living with AIDS, the Magic Johnsons. But anyway, Larry Kramer used to be the director in New York City of the Gay Men's Health Center, a big, important place. And AIDS came on the scene in 81, 82, and people started just dying. Gay men started dying, and at first they sort of called it gay-related. It actually had that term in the name.
I think it's GRID.
GRID, yeah, gay-related immune deficiency. And Kramer was outraged by the fact that public health officials, the government at every level, New York City, New York State, the federal government, nobody was doing anything. Reagan was president, didn't mention the word AIDS until 6 or 7 years into his term. Just silence. And he was outraged. And one night he was speaking in New York City, and he asked 2/3 of the people to stand up, and they did. And he said, "You're going to be dead in 5 years." And actually that was true. Most of them were. You can go to San Francisco and you just won't see men of a certain age in the Castro. They're just not there. They're all dead. He said to them, and this is a direct quote, "If my speech tonight doesn't scare the shit out of you, we're in real trouble. If what you're hearing doesn't rouse you to anger, fury, rage, and action, gay men will have no place, no future here on earth. How long does it take before you get angry enough to fight back?" Then he asked the people there, he said, "Do you want to start a political organization that is dedicated to direct action?" And there was a resounding yes, we do. 3 days later, about 300 people got together in New York City and started what is called ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. ACT UP. He's still an activist, and he went on to write a number of plays. He's a playwright, author. There's a lot of, if you look out on the web, there's a lot of YouTube interviews with him. And because this is now the 25th anniversary. They started in March 1987, last month, 25 years ago. And in fact, they're having a 25th anniversary in April with Occupy Wall Street. So they're doing an action. So, you know, he's been at it a long time. Principles of ACT UP. Radical direct action. They were tired of the mainstream, if there was such a thing in 1989, 89, the mainstream LGBTQ, the lesbian and gay organizations. They thought they were too moderate. Lobbying wasn't going to get you anywhere. Being nice wasn't going to get you anywhere. It needed more direct action. Participatory democracy. No leaders. No one person could speak for ACT UP, and everyone could speak for ACT UP. They had a committee structure, so there was a youth committee and you know, the homeless committee, and they had subgroups of, you know, Hispanic. So they did groups and they did issues in committee structures, and then the committees brought things to there was a coordinating committee, and that was the biggest structure there was the coordinating committee. And they met once a week. But everything required a total membership vote. They were absolutely committed, and it's an interesting thing because most of the people involved initially were gay white men who were well educated. Larry Kramer went to Yale. A lot of them had a lot of privilege, and they had that privilege worked to them until they got AIDS, and then it didn't work at all. Nothing they could do. The fact that they came from upper middle or upper class families didn't help them get treatment, didn't help them get drugs, didn't help them at all. So, but they were very active in saying AIDS affects all kinds of people, not just us, and we need to make this group inclusive. And there were women involved in ACT UP, and in fact, AIDS probably brought the gay and the lesbian communities together much more than they had been. The lesbians had generally, in the 70s, had been pissed off at the gay white men who were, you know, saying, "Could you make the coffee, honey?" You know, and they're like, "No, we're not making the coffee." So there was the sexism, but AIDS changed all that, and in fact, lesbians got very involved. So anyway, they were committed to not only taking care of themselves as a quote of, you know, the middle class men, but also women, racial minorities, and people in poverty and people without voice and power in the culture, the homeless, drug addicts, people in prison, that kind of thing. So here's one of their first big demonstrations. This is in New York City, and you can see they're playing to rage, fight back, fight. I mean, the rhetoric is strong rhetoric. It's not please, may we. Anyway, this Kramer and these people got together in March of 1987, and about 3 weeks later they had their first demonstration. And the first demonstration was in Wall Street. And what they wanted was they wanted the drug companies to stop making so much money off of the drugs that were keeping people alive a little bit. And they were particularly after Wellcome Burroughs, which is a drug company that made AZT. AZT was the drug of treatment in those days. They had 7 demands. And what's interesting is you look back 25 years later, they actually achieved a lot of them. Immediate release of the Federal Food and Drug Administration of drugs that might save our lives. And in those days, it took 5 to 10 years to bring a drug to release from, you know, people were dying. Immediate abolishment of those double-blind studies where some people get the drugs, some people don't. And of course, people don't get the drugs die if the drug has any efficacy. Release of drugs to everyone with AIDS or AIDS-related complex, ARC. Availability of the drugs at affordable prices. Mass public education to stop the spread of AIDS. They really hit this over and over and over again. They worked tirelessly to get this into the schools and so that kids didn't get AIDS. Prohibit discrimination in treatment, insurance, employment, housing. When AIDS first hit, America was really ugly. It was really ugly if you were alive in those days. And you remember, they threw little kids out. I mean, they practically burned down their parents' houses. There were laws being proposed all over the United States for quarantine, tattooing all the people with AIDS. The discrimination was fierce. And partly because at that point, nobody quite knew how he got AIDS. They weren't quite clear. Police and firefighters would wear gloves and masks because they didn't know if you could catch it like a cold. And it killed people in those days. People didn't live 35 years with AIDS. They died. Horrible, awful deaths. Immediate establishment of a coordinated, comprehensive, and compassionate national policy. They wanted a national policy. They were living in New York City. And lots of the ACT UP chapters were in San Francisco, the big cities, Philly, Chicago, San Francisco. They had sometimes better relationships with government in those cities. But nationally, if you were in Alabama, hey, with AIDS, or you were, so they wanted a national policy. So those were their demands. At this first protest on Wall Street, this is from the New York Times, and you can see the way language changes already. The homosexuals were arrested. A lot of people, from the very beginning, they were all willing to go to jail however many times. That was part of the commitment to direct action in ACT UP, and lots of them just went and went and went and went and went. But anyway, a few days later, the FDA announces it'll shorten the drug approval process by 2 years. So they're already having an impact after the first demonstration. Now, maybe it's coincidence, right? They selected certain institutions and targets to really go after. Now, you got to also understand, this is pre-internet smartphones. They did all of this with print, posters, flyers, whatever. Over the years, they hit virtually every medical institution you can think of that had any connection to AIDS. All the federal agencies, the FDA, the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control. They hit the private ones like AMA. They hit all the international AIDS conferences. Then they hit all the political organizations. I mean, they really focused in on who was responsible for the neglect of AIDS and for what was going on. So they start with the presidents. Good place to start. And Reagan was a great target, eh? Yeah. George Bush, Senior Bush. Clinton, they thought was going to be different. They met with Clinton while he was a candidate. He promised to do all kinds of things. He didn't quite keep all his promises. So he gets, later on, they go after him. Obviously, the FDA. Drug companies. 1 million people with AIDS isn't a market that's exciting. Sure, it's growing, but it's not asthma. That's the CEO of a drug company, Hoffman LaRoche. When you think about drugs, you got to think about your market, eh? That's why malaria isn't real popular with drug companies, malarial drugs. Oh, yeah. They go after organized religion, and they particularly go after Catholicism. This is John Cardinal O'Connor, and because they won't have anything to do, of course, with safe sex or condoms or, because that's unnatural. They actually break into St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City during a mass and disrupt it. And that becomes very controversial because I can't quite tell, but there are differing accounts. One account says there was actually that the host, communion host in the Catholic Church, which is considered very sacred, was desecrated during the demonstration. But it was very controversial, and a lot of people were like, "You've gone too far now that you can go after the politicians, but not the church." There's another poster that has a picture of the Pope on it, and it says, "Know your scumbags." All of this, by the way, the New York Public Library has a wonderful digital media library that has all of ACT UP documented. That's just incredible. There's a lot of stuff out there on the web if you're interested. So they go after the organized religion. They go after the media. On this one, see that kid right there? This person right there? I don't know if my pointer... That is a protester who has broken into the CBS Evening News. That's Dan Rather sitting back there. And Dan Rather says, "This is the CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting. Good evening." And the protester yells, "Fight AIDS, not Arabs. Fight AIDS, not Arabs," on national TV. This is on the YouTube. You can see this. It's very unclear, but you can see it. They also, that same night, break into PBS, national TV, the news, and do this with Jim Lara. And so they go after the media, and they, very, very direct. Homophobic politicians. This is Newt 2, I guess, what we're seeing of Newt Gingrich. But Newt 1 was the contract. It was called the Contract for America. A lot of people called it the Contract on America. And you see these kinds of things. Jesse Helms. Anybody remember Jesse Helms? He was he was a right-wing radio announcer, much like Rush Limbaugh. He got himself elected in North or South Carolina, I can't remember which one, and became the senator. He was anti-everything, but he was really anti-gay. They went to his house in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and put a huge fabric condom over his house. I think it was one of their best all-time actions myself. And here's what it says. It says, "Condom to stop unsafe politics. Helms is deadlier than a virus." And here's this gigantic condom floating up over his house. They went after the economics. They really went after the economics of AIDS. And they over and over again talked about the greed. And they had things like kissing campaigns. This was on the side of buses in New York City, San Francisco, a number of places. Corporate greed, government inaction, public indifference. Profiteering. Poisoned from ATZ, dying on AZT. Dead from greed, dead from homophobia. The thing, of course, about ACT UP was this is all literally true. It's literal. People are dying. And most of these activists died. The gay men died. Most of them died. So obviously it had urgency. They were committed to, as I've already suggested, diversity, and so they talk about class inequalities and racism. 1 in every 61 babies in New York City is born with AIDS or born HIV antibiotic positive. So why is the media telling us that heterosexuals aren't at risk? Because those babies are black. Those babies are Hispanic. Ignoring color ignores the facts of AIDS. Stop racism, fight AIDS. They're making these connections all the time between AIDS, racism, sexism, anti-immigrant sentiment. You know, they're really putting it all together. And you see this poster as Spanish. Women. Women don't get AIDS. That's what the media says. 65% of HIV-positive women get sick and die from chronic infections that don't fit the Center for Disease Control definition of AIDS. So they are denied access to what little health care there is. The CDC must expand the definition of AIDS. So they don't get it, they just die from it. And in fact, right now, the largest growing population of people with AIDS is still, and it's been this way for about 10 years, African American women and Hispanic women in the United States, heterosexual. People with AIDS are dying from homes. They talk about the homeless a lot. They push over and over for needle exchange. And of course, nobody likes drug addicts. So what's the problem if they die? Not with ACT UP. They are pushing, and they have some success on occasion with needle exchange. If people are going to be IV drug users, give them clean needles. They talk about prisoners. They do prison programs. They argued from day one for a single unified healthcare system, because they understood that access to health care was what was going to keep people in. If they had any chance of surviving, that's what they needed, is health care that they could afford. So you see, I mean, you can look at protest pictures from the 80s, it's just all over health care, about health care, single payer health care. This says no more bull, universal health care now on his sign. This is 1991, we demand to cure universal health care. They do a lot of actions at the White House. And this is one of their first this is one of the first. They organized themselves in March of 87, June 1st, 87, they're at the White House. And that's what this is. And they commit disobedience, civil disobedience, they get arrested. And they do this over and over again. They also start going to the international AIDS conferences, and they stop them, disrupt them, they do all kinds of things, and they go thereafter. And they're all over the world at that point. And they go and they do actions there. This is, they do 9 days. In 1988, they do 9 days of activism all over the country. 50 cities participate in 9 days of action. And they're focusing on prison programs, on intravenous drug users, people of color, women, and children with AIDS all over the country. There's all kinds of Chicago, Minneapolis, Seattle, they're all over, big cities. Big action. And of course this is about immigrants, that the United States now wants to start deporting all these immigrants if they have a positive HIV status. And it's like, they got it here, folks. You know, so that's what this poster's about. In 1988, they shut down the FDA for a day. Over 1,000 people are there, and a couple hundred get arrested. It gets international press coverage. These are some of the people at the protest. In 1989, they get into the New York Stock Exchange and shut down trading. 7 of them actually get up into this VIP balcony, and they unfurl this huge banner that says "Sell Welcome Burroughs," stocks, the makers of AZT. And 4 days later, Burroughs lowers the price of AZT from $8,000 a year to $6,400 a year, which is a 20% cut. Now, you also understand most people had, the minute you got AIDS, you were uninsured. And for a while, insurance companies were absolutely, they just decided they weren't going to insure any single men between the ages of 18 and 30 because they might be gay and they might have AIDS. So they just wouldn't insure them. That's part of what was going on. So this is the New York Stock Exchange, one of the New York Stock Exchange actions. They come to Chicago in 1990. And they're after the AMA, which has its headquarters there. And the women's coalition takes over Cook County Hospital. I don't know if any of you know about Cook County, but it's the hospital that serves all the poor in Cook County. At that point, they would not admit any women with AIDS into Cook County Hospital. So you're poor. You can't even go to the worst hospital in the city and die because they won't let you in. So they do this mattress action. They bring all these mattresses. You can see these folks are sitting on mattresses, and they declare themselves to be the Cook County Hospital Women's AIDS Unit. And again, there's thousands of people here, and people are arrested, the whole 9 yards. Then 2 days later, Cook County announces it's going to have a women's AIDS unit. You know, one of the things I learned in collective bargaining at the university is administrators hate negative publicity. They just hate it. They just hate it. It's one of the things that troublemakers always have in their pocket. It's just like you can make them so uncomfortable. And ACT UP did that they just shamed people. You know, bad publicity. And it's too bad you have to do that to make people do the right thing, but it often works. ACT UP produced tons of literature. This is a book that they produced that one of the women's unit in New York produced on women AIDS and activism. But they became this incredible repository of knowledge about AIDS. And in fact, there's some evidence that the CDC kept secretly, some of the doctors at the CDC who were sympathetic kept turning to ACT UP for help on things and for information about what was really going on. In 1991, they declare a day of desperation, and what they meant was they wanted everybody in the United States to realize that every day for somebody with AIDS was a day of desperation. This is the day they invaded public broadcasting system and CBS. This is the day they did that. The next day, they do this 2 days. The next day, they go to Wall Street, and they start delivering 2,000 coffins, cardboard coffins. And they deliver them to the White House. They deliver them in Congress. They deliver them to mayor of New York City, Chicago, all over the country. Any public officials that they feel have been particularly non-responsive on AIDS, they deliver these coffins to and say, and I mean, they spattered blood around, sometimes fake and sometimes real. And of course, by that time, people did understand you could get HIV from blood, positive blood. So that scared the crap out of people, as you can imagine, when they did that kind of stuff. You know, there's this old joke in the gay community, whatever, LGBTQ, all the letters, whatever you want to call it, has a good and a bad sense of humor. I mean, I'll tell you this old joke that out of the gay community. A young gay man comes home, he's not out to his parents, and he says, well, Mom, maybe you remember these jokes, the good news, the bad news. Jokes. He said, well, do you want the good news or the bad news first? And the parents sit there and they say, well, give us the bad news. And he said, well, the bad news is I'm gay. I said, well, what's the good news? Good news is I have AIDS. A grim joke. But, you know, you're dying. Nobody's helping you. The world that was supposed to treat you like a nice, I mean, parents, what they were doing to gay and lesbian, their children in those days was not generally a nice thing for most people. And then AIDS. I know a woman in Springfield whose son died of AIDS, and she never, to this day, has ever told anyone that he died of AIDS. That's how closeted she is. So, a lot of that kind of stuff. They actually get, here's a ACT UP action where they're trying to get condoms in public schools. Wrap it up already. And they're starting to see, and you know, we're starting to see kids coming down with AIDS because they're not having safe sex. So finally, in 1991, the New York City School Board, and this is a big breakthrough because they're one of the first, votes to give condoms to all the kids in public high schools. Oh, you can imagine the Christian right on this one. Oh, not good, but they did it. They got it done. In 1992, you have a presidential election. And of course, there's Bush, Sr., there's Bill Clinton, Pat Buchanan, Paul Tsongas. Here's Buchanan, sort of made out to look like Hitler. See the little mustache there? AIDS disaster. They were nonpartisan, and they went after Tsongas and said, where's your AIDS plan? They went after everybody. I mean, they were like, we don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican. How are you dealing with AIDS? Here's Bush's war on AIDS prevention. So they made the campaign a big issue. In 1992, they start, and you don't try to read this because it's really unclear, but look at the shape of that. That's an urn. And here's what it says. You've lost someone to AIDS. For more than a decade, your government has mocked your loss. You have spoken out in anger, joined political protests, carried fake coffins, mocked tombstones, spattered red paint to represent someone's HIV-positive blood, perhaps your own. George Bush believes that the White House gates shield him from you, your loss, and his responsibility for the AIDS crisis. Now is the time to bring AIDS home to George Bush. On October 11th, we will carry the actual ashes of people we love in funeral procession to the White House. In an act of grief and rage and love, we will deposit their ashes on the White House lawn. Join us to protest 12 years of genocidal AIDS policy. That's what that said. And when they get there, they are met by the White House police in riot gear on horses and motorcycles. And these people, you know, I mean, they're walking. But there's 8,000 of them at that point, and they break through the police lines, and they in fact scatter the ashes on the White House lawn. Their AIDS activists were dying like crazy at this point. It's 1992, mid-90s. A lot of people are really sick and dying. A lot of men. And many of them want public funerals in the streets. And so it's the beginning of what are called the political funerals. And most of these people have been very strong activists, AIDS activists. One fellow, Tim Bailey, asked them to throw his body over the gate of the White House lawn, just when he was dead. And his friends said, no, we won't do that because it's a desecration of your body. Not them, but your body. We won't do it. But they had a public funeral for Tim and a number of people, and this is one of them. Over our dead bodies. Again, funny, powerful, literal. On the 10th anniversary, they go back to Wall Street. Crash the Market is the name of their demonstration. And they actually shut down Lower Manhattan for about 3 hours. Their issues at that point are price gouging. Is this a theme? By the pharmaceutical companies and cutbacks in Medicaid funding for poor people, funding for poor people. And they demand congressional hearings on drug pricing. Nothing, of course, Congress does nothing. On the 20th anniversary, they go back to Wall Street. They demand, as always, single-payer health care, drug price controls. There were corporate, again, they sort of shut things down and tied things up in Lower Manhattan, and there were some corporate onlookers who were pretty annoyed, and some of them held up signs that said, "We're sorry if 25 million dead people have inconvenienced you crossing the street." They did not, they didn't care if people liked them. I mean, they didn't care. They weren't going to be nice, because what was happening to them wasn't nice. There's another New York City action. This is also the 20th anniversary. And they just laid down in all the streets. They just, and Manhattan's a nightmare anyway on a good day. But it's, particularly bad. So that's a sort of very quick run through, and there's a lot in between, but so there were some problems. Some of the controversial actions, people really felt it was too much. It was, you're going to alienate a lot of the people you're actually trying to reach. And if you do that, what's the point? Are you just expressing yourself, or are you actually communicating? You may communicate and piss people off, and they won't listen to you anymore. Or you might communicate. And so there were arguments, a lot of arguments about strategy. What was too much? Was breaking into the St. Pat's too much? What was too much? So, everybody could sort of agree that putting up a sign with, about Reagan nobody had problems with that. But there were other actions that people felt were, and I'm talking about ACT UP members, felt was too much. There was, from the beginning, dissatisfaction with the lack of structures, lack of leaders, chaotic, unfocused meetings. People felt like you could go to meetings that lasted, they were notorious. They'd last for 4 or 5 hours, and there would be no decision. Everybody's laughing. I sat in consciousness raising groups for feminists in the women's movement early on, so I've been there, done that. I know what that is. Joanne Freeman, who is a feminist writer who did all that also, because there were, we're not going to have any leaders. So if you had any skill, and actually in some organizations, if you actually had skills, you got sort of pulled down. That metaphor, there's a lobster trying to get out of the pot, and all the other lobsters grab on and pull it back into the boiling pot. That people who could emerge with certain skills and leaders were sometimes held back by their own members and saying, no, we don't want you to exercise your skills or your leadership. What Joanne Freeman called the tyranny of structurelessness. Obviously, a lot of their strongest activists were dying in the male community. There were splinter groups. Queer Nation was very radical, even more radical than ACT UP. They were very short-lived. Lesbian Avengers actually lasted for quite a long time and still exists in some remnant forms. Sarah Schulman is one of their people, and a great writer and thinker. A treatment action group is still in existence. This is very, they have a board of directors, and the only way you get in is, or used to get in, I don't know if this is still true, but the only way you got in was if you were invited to become a member. So very undemocratic, very high, but they got shit done. They were more moderate, conservative, and did a lot of lobbying, but they also had some influence. By 1996, a lot of the people who write about ACT UP, I'm an academic, so I read books and all that shit about this stuff. So a lot of the writers and thinkers on ACT UP say by the mid 90s, it was kind of losing steam. About 10 years. Now, chapters continued and still continue. And some of those chapters have gone on to do more international stuff, working, really pushing hard for like AIDS in Africa and all the issues there, which is, so many people are dying of AIDS and they have no access to care or drugs or money or all those things. So those are some of the problems. What did it accomplish? I think it accomplished when you go back to their 7 demands of what they wanted, they accomplished almost all of them. They didn't get a comprehensive health care policy. They didn't get a single unit, and here we're still fighting that fight. That's still going to go on in the United States. But they revolutionized the drug research and approval process. They revolutionized, we treat people with AIDS much more humanely and decently now than at the beginning. It was horrific. And so they really did a lot of that. They revolutionized the drug research approval process. They forced the FDA to speed up. They forced drug companies to lower prices, and they really have been lowered substantially. And now, drug companies, I love drug companies because they have outrageous prices in the United States. And then they have ads on TV. If you need help with getting these drugs, call us. We'll help you. That's because they're so fucking unaffordable, honey. Because they're gouging everybody else. I was in Thailand in December, and I left all my prescription drugs in a hotel at O'Hare. So I walked into a pharmacy with my Thai friend, and we bought 2.5 weeks of prescription drugs for about $3 at the pharmacy there. Same drug, same packaging, same drug, same manufacturer, same drug. No prescription needed either, but They redefined AIDS so that it wasn't perceived entirely anymore as just gay men. And, AIDS definition in those bad old days was the good victims of AIDS, babies, infants, children, hemophiliacs, and then the bad people who got AIDS. And those were the drug users and people who had sex, that bad thing, sex, So, and gay people, of course. So, they redefined AIDS entirely to say this affects everybody, and it's a disease, not God's punishment. Contrary to Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, I don't know, all those guys. They forced the government to include people with AIDS in disability programs, and that's really been important, particularly for poor people. Because once you're disabled, you have access to different kinds of services and subsistence it's subsistence, but still it's something. I don't know how many of you saw the film Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, but you couldn't be fired if you had AIDS legally because you had AIDS. They could fire you for other reasons, but they couldn't fire you because you had AIDS. So those things really changed from the beginning to later. And finally, I think, and this is, I think it's very substantial, this one, that they created a blueprint for how to get things done for activism. It's not a blueprint that a lot of people are comfortable with, but it is a blueprint. And they did get a lot of stuff done because they were in your face all the time. They were very focused on, but they just went after people. So that's the 25th. We're coming up on the 25th. I mean, we've actually March 24th was the 25th anniversary of their first demonstration. So the real 25th anniversary is March of this last year. But you can see on April 25th, they're doing a 25-year anniversary action. AIDS is not over, but it could be. Tax Wall Street to end AIDS. Act Up and Occupy. A picture of the bull that's out in front of the New York Stock Exchange. And a kind of nice poster. So that's the end of what I want to say. I guess what I'd like to sort of throw open is the question now of what are the lessons to learn for Occupy? What are the lessons to learn from ACT UP? What are the pitfalls to avoid? What are the lessons to learn? What do you take away from this that will help you in Occupy, the Occupy movement? What does the Occupy movement need to change, not change, rethink?
I think something that really speaks to me is a realization that, no matter what massive force we think Occupy Wall Street is, we've been around 6 months.
Right. It's young.
6 years from now, 25 years from now, we will make things happen, but it's not going to be an overnight thing. I think there are a lot of people that grow weary over time and they don't show up anymore.
The McDonaldization of we gotta have everything fasted.
I think they have to realize there can be change, but you have to be in it for the long haul.
When I came here, I started lobbying downtown in the legislature for what eventually became the Human Rights Bill that included sexual orientation and gender identity. It took 25 years to get that sucker passed. 25 years. And I was here 25 years and remember every stupid minute of it. But 25 years, I think about that and I go, God, it took us 25 years to get it. We got it, but wow. You got to be, I'm a big fan of dogs. So like a terrier, they bite, they clam on, and they don't let go. And that's what you have to be if you're an activist. And I think that is one of the lessons of ACT UP. It took them a long time. Yeah.
I like how they were able to not only recognize the, all the intersections of, race, classism,
right.
Poverty, gender, all of it, but they weren't, I think that most activists, movements over time have recognized those intersections, but they were able to actually play on them,
right.
And while they may have been controversial, I think those, that type of thinking was what allowed them to bring people into the movement that they hadn't been able to before. So you're going to scare these people away, but these people are really going to like that you've, not only realized it, but are acting on it.
ACT UP did some really amazing things. For some of the stuff they did around prison programs and homelessness and needle exchange, this was the first time that some of those populations ever saw a middle-class white person care about them and advocate on their behalf. And that was very powerful. And when you look at all the photos and start reading about ACT UP, you see, you have people who didn't finish grade school to, PhDs from Yale. And they're in the same, and they really understand that they're in the same boat. That's amazing in the United States, because usually those divisions really keep us apart. So it's impressive. Now, AIDS, everybody gets it, or everybody can get AIDS. It is non-discriminatory in that way. But obviously there were populations that were more at risk because of behavior. But
I think I can clearly see that the Occupy movement's trying to use greed as their AIDS, the thing that everybody's affected by it, and maybe it's not because we can draw a clear medical line to, corporate greed is killing people. I mean, it obviously directly is killing people, but there's no medical science that's explaining it, and so maybe I clearly see that that's what we're trying to use as our AIDS.
right.
But I wonder how we get past that. You've got to rush your way through the rhetoric and the conditioning. And
One of the things I wonder about Occupy is if it shouldn't do some very specific things, like let's do a day about student loans. Let's march on the Department of Education and banks, or particular banks, and shut them down that day, and say, so that it's concrete and specific as opposed to greed. Oh, who's not greedy sometimes? At the dinner table, or, so greed is nice and corporate greed is great, but what are the specific grievances that Occupy might really go after? Why not invade a few banks over the worst mortgage lending? Very specific actions that affect very specific groups of people. And that's one of the things. Camping in a park is great, but look at what ACT UP did. They went after very specific institutions, very specific events, and they really focused. Now, their focus was broad when you look at the big picture. But on day X, they were only going to deal with, needle exchange or whatever. I'm, giving you examples, but it's one of the things that I think made them very effective. They got specific.
I think you'll see more of that.
I'm hoping that we.
And Occupy Springfield was very focused on the tax break for the Chicago Board of Trade and the. And Sears. Right. And that we got a lot of good response from being very focused on that issue.
Right. I think the more specific you are, people can go, oh yeah, because they get it. It's concrete.
The thought that I had was that we should keep doing the connecting things and having teach-ins as much as possible. At the same time, we should have more dramatic actions. We should up that on the specific, on the worst things that are because of what the problems that we're upset about: homelessness, people dying from not being able to go to the hospital. Right. That's pretty dramatic, and that's pretty direct. Yeah. And related to, and people are dying, children are dying. There's shanty towns now in America, like the third world country. Right.
Yeah, I think, being focused on specific injuries, because that's really what they are.
And I think another thing that you can learn is if you look at their actions, those actions were very well planned. It was not, they did not go into the...
They were ready to...
Yeah, they didn't go to Dan Rather's place saying, well, let's go do this, you know.
No.
There was some serious conversation, some serious planning before
Oh, yeah.
the action was done.
Yeah. When they got into the stock exchange, 7 of them dressed up in suits and had fake credentials made. I mean, they planned this. I mean, they really planned it. It was a little bit on Mission Impossible side, you know. And they also knew they were going to get arrested. And that was just part and parcel of it. But they did a lot of planning, and they really were organized in that sense of it. They didn't just do things spontaneously, I guess is, you know. This is political action. That happened in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was part of a lot of that. And people would sit down and plan a action for months before you actually did it. And it, you know, sometimes. I mean, there were other things that happened more spontaneously, but yeah. What else are the lessons?
Well, just to give an example of just the raw greed that goes into something like this, and I actually just learned about this last night, watching a movie that was based on a true story, is that hypodermic needles, I think before the mid-50s, were all made of glass. Mm-hmm. And once you would use that hypodermic, it could be boiled. And it didn't matter what was inside of it, it was sterile. Mm-hmm. Once they started to develop plastics, you can't boil them, you can't sterilize them. Were we still on a system of using glass, which obviously has nowhere near the profit margin of plastic, people knowingly, I mean, people know the risks they take oftentimes, but they could knowingly boil the needle before reusing it. Or even in Africa, where it's not about using needles for drug issues, there's health clinics that will reuse needles hundreds of times.
Right.
It's just ridiculous.
I was just reading about the Obama administration. You know, they've turned all these student loans over to collectors. Well, the collectors have it's a bounty system. And in theory, they're supposed to make reasonable arrangements with the person to pay back their loan. But the reality is the financial rewards are for actually getting, the larger the payment they get, guess what? The more money they get. Well, gee, you think that has any effect on the behavior? Duh. So actually the people that they've hired are really, I used to deal with bill collectors when I did poverty law. Oh man, talk about scumbags. You know, and they'd all have these names like Miss Love, you know, and that kind of thing. I mean, they so, you know, it's like, what the hell what are they doing? I mean, you know, if they want to change the United States, just one simple way is do some debt forgiveness. I mean, that would be, you know. So, I mean, student loans, but all the people with mortgages that are underwater. I mean, there's so many things, specific things that could be targeted. Institutions, governmental, private, you know, that makes the greed real as opposed to just abstract. What are other lessons you think, other things you take away from ACT UP, what you've seen or heard?
I like that, I mean, since we just talked about how they were able to focus down so hard on something, and you kind of mentioned this, but I like how while doing that, they were still able to take the broad perspective.
Yeah.
You know, Occupy's been constantly hounded for bullet points, you know, and there's positives and negatives to that. You know, the more the bullet points, people will understand you better, but the more bullet points, the less people that can then support you from within your movement. You know, and I like how, as far as their blueprint, I liked their model about, you know, maintaining the broad organizational look, but when you go in for action, focusing it down.
Their committee structure really was pretty effective in some ways. It was the committees that were able to sort of drill down on issues. and recommend then to the broader group real specific things. We're the committee on IV drug use. We're the committee on condoms in schools. We're the committee on, how do we reach Hispanic people? How do, or whatever. So they had tons of committees. I mean, tons. When you go look at their literature, you'll see how many committees. They had a lot of committees, a lot. I mean, they really took AIDS and they dissected it into these very small parts that were manageable, because AIDS is huge. If you just say AIDS, well, but when you start taking, okay, what about this part? What about that part? What about, this group? What about that group? Then it was sort of a committee could handle one piece of it as opposed to the whole thing. What should we do about AIDS? That sounds like a bad exam question at the end of a class or something where, that's kind of like what people write 1,000-page books about. What should we do about AIDS? It's too big. So the committee structure really allowed them to focus down on very specific things and yet come back to the larger group, and as long as you sort of distribute the stuff through all the committees, I mean, you don't just focus on drug research. You don't just focus on IV drug users. You move around in a circle and keep spiraling through those issues and groups so that in the end, it's comprehensive. But everybody's working on a piece of it that's manageable.
And I think that coming back to the big group is probably at the end is what allowed them to maintain. Because once you spent 3 months planning an action on a very specific thing, it's going to be very hard to convince you that this isn't the right course of action for this reason or another. Because you put so much.
You get invested.
Yeah, and even if you weren't invested, you just focused on needle exchange or this or that for so long that you've got the blinders on, and when you go back to that big group, it'll definitely. I think that's what that enabled them to still have that broad approach. Is there's going to be 5 times as many people who haven't been talking about needle exchange at all that you're going to have to convince.
There were fights over which issues were more important. I mean, there were people who felt that education was absolutely it's like, okay, people got AIDS, but now we got to stop people from getting it. Prevention. Well, yeah, but there are all these people out there with AIDS who don't know they have it, and they're spreading it, and they always, they weren't able completely to stop this, and this is why some of the splits occurred, but they tried to say, we have to keep all these balls moving in the air. You can't just focus on prevention, because here's all these people dying right now who are infected, and we've got to do something. But you can't just focus on that. They're saying, well, who gives a shit about prevention? We're dying.
I know that there's people get a little discouraged in Springfield. There's a large body of activists here in Springfield, and always has been. Not maybe as big as you'd want, but back in the day we had AIDS Walk in Springfield for several years, and it was a small group that got it going. And we even hosted AIDS Walk out at UIS one year. You look at the churches, and believe it or not, Sarah Center, which was for AIDS, was started by a Catholic nun in Springfield. So there are some people where you might not expect to find them that I think will eventually get involved in the movement.
Catholic Church will always provide you both ends.
Yeah.
You'll get the radical, the liberation theologists out of
Right.
it too.
As Che said, don't worry about the communists, worry about the Catholics. But he was talking about the liberation theology.
I appreciate the perspectives things like this lend me, because when this went on, I was such a young child that I was fairly oblivious to it. I mean, sure, when I was growing up, I saw Philadelphia and I saw Kids, which are both about AIDS awareness, but that especially healthcare and health insurance was such a major focus 20, 30 years ago, and still we're fighting that fight. And
Yep.
It shows the power of greedy insurance companies.
Well, part of what Larry Kramer said, if this doesn't rouse you to anger, fury, and rage and action. And that's part of what's happening in the United States, is at what point do people say, enough. And that's part of what Occupy is tapping into.
And I think Occupy has stirred that. And we're starting to see people who, for many years, have not been interested in getting at all involved, at least are now having conversations.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's obviously lots of similarities, and there have been gay and lesbian caucuses within, and lots of involvement, but it's just, it's kind of, from my perspective, it's kind of nice to look back and say, this didn't just spring up. When people would say, where'd the gay rights movement come from? Well, it didn't just pop out of nowhere. There were people in the 40s and 30s and 40s and 50s who made that happen in the 70s and 80s and 90s. In feminism, we talk about the second wave, the first wave and the second wave, but there's something that connects those waves. It's a trough, but it's still connected. And there's moments of political action or movements, and then there's times when things are kind of more quiet, and that may be the trough. But I tend to think that there's political action consistently that's just less visible and more visible. And if you read a lot about social movements, we're due. We're way due. And the movement, in my view, that's going to connect it is the movement that connects all the dots, so that it can't be a single group movement. It has to connect the racism and the sexism and the class and the poverty and all of that together. That's the movement. Tied in with, ecological issue. I mean, it's all got to be put together. That's the movement. But I also think the thing about this is you've got to find your niche and your piece that you can really dig into, because you can't do the whole movement, because that just feels overwhelming. So that's. Any other comments about this? There's a number of books about this. There's a number of films. There's a really new. It's not real new, but there's a really good film called "Surviving the Plague" about AIDS activism. There's a lot of stuff on the web about this, if you want to read more, or see more, or listen to more. There's a lot of interviews with Larry Kramer for the 20th anniversary. There's a webcast of women in San Francisco talking on the 25th anniversary about their activism for 25 years. So there's a lot. If you're curious about wanting to know more, there's a lot out there. So that's it.